Hi, welcome to my channel where we discuss anything and everything to do with mental health and psychology. In this video, we will be going through KSA 6, which is maintaining and managing records and reports. So firstly, what are they asking for? And within this KSA, what they're asking for is for you to demonstrate the understanding and the skills for maintaining and managing formal and informal records, documents, anything that's part of your profession, report writing, progress notes, anything related to recording information and documents that you have access to which have personal information about patients. So this belongs to the skills section of the KSA. And what you'll need to demonstrate this, like the other criterion within the skills section, is that you'll need a self-statement and a reference. But then you can also countersign your self-statement instead of having a reference. Does that make sense? So self-statement and a reference, or countersign your self-statement. And this can be any professional that can account for you or support that you have these skills. So they've seen you demonstrate these skills within practice. For BABCP, you'll also need another type of evidence. So you'll need the self-statement and the reference, but you will also need one of the following. So a training course, a self-directed study, or the job criteria for a job you're currently doing or one that you've done in the past. And that eligibility or that getting hired for a job that requires that criteria can provide support that you have that skill. So let's get into what you'll need for the self-statement. And for the self-statement, what you'll really need is to show that you have an understanding of the legislation, of policies and practices, and then demonstrate how you have the skills. Does that make sense? So how I started mine was to demonstrate my knowledge and give my awareness of policies and procedures and legislation. And then I went into personalizing that to demonstrate, because in this you have to give two illustrative examples. So two examples which demonstrate that you have the skills and the knowledge and the understanding that you've mentioned. So first, I started with acknowledging how within healthcare you will be handling sensitive information, whether that's directly from the patient that you've gained or the information that you have access to. To demonstrate that you have that understanding for the legislation, what I did was I highlighted all the legislations that applied. I didn't necessarily talk about all of them, but I highlighted the ones that could apply and the ones that are important to be aware of. And then I showed my understanding by defining that law or legislation. To show that you understand each law, say what they are, say why they're important, and highlight the limitations. So some laws might be restricted by other laws. So for example, the Freedom of Information Act might be limited by the Data Protection Act, and the Freedom of Information Act also has exemptions that need to be followed too. For example, if there's a risk or there's some kind of threat or there's a rationale for the information not to be shared. So there's also within the Data Protection Act the right of access. So know about these laws and highlight their limitations as well as why they're important and what they're there for. Does that make sense? So that gives you an all-rounded understanding of the laws and how they interact with each other and how they're applied in practice. Then I went on to talk about why it's necessary for information shared or stored or handled in a way that's appropriate, relevant, necessary and accurate. And I spoke about how it can gain appropriate services, it can increase productivity, because as I mentioned, the service doesn't have to almost search through information to find why you've referred the person. Inaccuracies within information can also lead to them being rejected for certain referrals or can lead to inappropriate referrals being made based on misinformation. So the risk there that could be made is that the person might be neglected, so rejected from referrals. So the person is not receiving the care and then therefore you're neglecting them by not giving them the appropriate services that they need to function. But at the same time, it could be that they're referred for services that disenables them to live independently, or reduces the amount that they're empowered to live independently, or the life that they want to live. Because it might be that they're allocated support that they don't actually need or they don't actually want. It can also help with the accuracy of care and continuity of care, because other information, whether they refer to other services, or if, let's say for example, you leave the service, or the service is somehow you're not in charge of the person's care anymore, or you're not involved in the person's care. It can also help with continuity of care. So if you record information accurately, relevant, appropriately, and all the necessary information, it can also help with not only in their period of care right now, but if they come back to the service or they go to another service, then it can almost provide a continuity where all their types of care is connected. Within that, I also spoke about policies and procedures that are in place to reinforce that law within practice and within organisations. And this is something that varies across organisations, so you can mention that, but then you can also mention the similarities that those things have. So I spoke about data management, Data Protection Act, Freedom of Information Act, Information Governance Management within services, data protection and confidentiality policies, reporting procedures for any breaches, and how clinical information was stored and managed within services and organisations. So for that, I also highlighted who's responsible. So who's responsible for breaches, who's responsible for encrypting data, who's responsible for all these things, because within organisations it's more of a hierarchy. Although everyone in contact with the information is responsible for keeping it safe, keeping it confidential, and securing it, but all the other processes and procedures that are in place in case things go wrong, or to develop systems to stop these informations being shared. Does that make sense? So I spoke about information or data that's stored in paper copies and how that's stored within services, computer and intranet systems, shared drives, things like that, and how is that made secure. For example, most of these things are password protected, have keys that are kept in key safes, or are password protected, have codes to get into them. Does that make sense? Then I also spoke about information sharing, which is part of healthcare, to provide that continuity of care across services. So I spoke about making sure that you send an email with patient information through secure encrypted emails or fax, and then you should always follow up to ensure that information has been received by the correct person. And obviously to make sure that it hasn't been received by the incorrect person. And if it has, what would you do? How do you report it? And for example, you might use Datex or some kind of incident reporting, and then ask the other person to shred that information. Does that make sense? You should also talk about why these procedures are in place. It's so that unauthorised personnel or unauthorised people cannot have access to sensitive personal data from patients and service users and anyone within the trust. Because it's not just patient information, it's also staff information and everything related to either care or anything related to personal information of anyone is protected. Then you can also talk about the procedures and the policies that are put in place to protect information being shared with those that are not in direct care. For example, if a staff member leaves, what's done? If a person is no longer in the care, what's done? Does that make sense? And how, for example, staff members who are not in the direct care of an individual, how is that managed? So not sharing smart cards if you work in the NHS, or not sharing logins, not sharing PINs, not sharing fobs or access cards. Does that make sense? So at the end of this, I put my 2 illustrative examples that it asks for. So I went through and generally spoke about legislation, policies, procedures, then the skills that are needed. Then I just round this off with 2 clear examples of how I demonstrate the skills and this knowledge in practice. So when you're picking your examples, pick things that demonstrate all the points that you've mentioned. Does that make sense? So it gives you all-rounded view of your ability to understand, the ability to acknowledge and be aware of, but then also your ability to apply this to practice. Does that make sense? So there's a separate part where it's asking for the knowledge and the understanding and knowing the skills, and then actually demonstrating the skills within practice. So within that example, I spoke about the breach. I spoke about what I did as a result of that breach. So what I did when I noticed it, how I explored whether it was accurate or not, so whether it was a mistake or not. And then I explored what I did and the processes and procedures I came to rectify that mistake that I had noticed. Does that make sense? So really a detailed description of the situation, the action or the task to be done, my response, and then the result. Does that make sense? So hopefully you found the example useful. I know I didn't go into detail about the service users and what happened in my specific examples, but I feel like this is just too public of a platform to share that on. But if you would want me to go through how I would do an example and just basically make one up just to show you the structure, then I can do that in another video. But the basic outline is situation, your the action or response, the result basically. So that's it for the video, guys. I hope you found it useful, and yeah, if you have any comments, questions or concerns, please leave them down in the comments. And yeah, bye for now, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.